Nobody stood up to the arrogant judge on court, until the maid's daughter faced him as a genius attorney in disguise. The courtroom was packed, but the silence was deafening. A man in black robes stared down from the bench, his voice cold as stone. "Does the defendant have anything to say?" he sneered. "Or shall we move on to the inevitable guilty verdict?" The woman in uniform trembled, clutching the rail as whispers rippled through the gallery. Laughter, disdain, the sound of power crushing someone too small to fight back. Then, unexpectedly, a voice cut through the tension, calm, steady, unshakable. "Actually, Your Honor, that's not far from the truth." Every head turned. Nobody could have imagined what would follow. What started as a routine trial meant to humiliate and destroy, ended as the unraveling of everything the powerful thought untouchable. This is the story of how a quiet daughter, hidden in the shadows, stood up against a giant. Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. A 17-year-old girl with no fancy suit, just a fire in her eyes, stood against a judge who broke spirits for a living. What secret was she hiding? And could it be enough to save her mother from a lie that could send her to prison for life? The Honorable Judge Wallace, a man whose scowl was as much a fixture in the courtroom as the scales of justice, glared down from his elevated bench. His courtroom was his kingdom, and he ruled it with an iron fist and a voice that could make seasoned lawyers tremble. Today, his gaze was fixed on a woman in a simple maid's uniform, her hands trembling as she stood beside a public defender who looked defeated before the trial had even begun. This was the trial of Eleanor Vance, accused of stealing a priceless necklace from the very family she had served for over 20 years. A family whose patriarch, Judge Wallace, was now presiding over her case. The conflict of interest was a thick, unspoken smog in the room, yet no one dared to challenge it. "Does the defendant have anything to say for herself?" Judge Wallace's voice boomed, dripping with disdain. "Or shall we move on to the inevitable guilty verdict?" Eleanor Vance, a woman whose life had been one of quiet dignity and hard work, could only shake her head, tears welling in her eyes. Her public defender, a young man named Peterson, barely out of law school, stammered, "Your Honor, my client maintains her innocence." We what, Mr. Peterson?" The judge cut him off. "We hope for a miracle? We believe the necklace simply grew legs and walked out of my wife's jewelry box? Spare me the theatrics." A ripple of nervous chuckles went through the well-dressed spectators, all friends and associates of the Wallace family. They had come to see a show, a quick and decisive display of the judge's power. They were not to be disappointed. But then, a clear, calm voice cut through the tension. "Actually, Your Honor, that's not far from the truth." All heads turned. Standing in the back of the courtroom was a young woman with a cascade of blonde hair. She was dressed in a simple, second-hand blazer and skirt, looking more like a high school student on a field trip than a participant in a high-stakes legal drama. It was Abigail Vance, Eleanor's daughter. For years, she had been a ghost in the Wallace mansion, a quiet girl who sometimes helped her mother with her duties, always with a book in her hand. To the Wallaces, she was nearly invisible, just another part of the background. Judge Wallace squinted. "And who, pray tell, are you?" "My name is Abigail Vance, Your Honor. I'm the defendant's daughter." She walked forward, her steps measured and confident, her gaze unwavering. "And I'm here to represent my mother." This time, the chuckles were louder, more unrestrained. Judge Wallace leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. "Represent her? Child, this is a court of law, not a school debate club. Are you a lawyer?" "I am not," Abigail said, stopping just before the bar. "But I know the law, and more importantly, I know the truth." "The truth?" the judge scoffed. "The truth is your mother is a thief who betrayed the trust of my family. The evidence is overwhelming. Now, sit down before I have you removed for contempt." "The evidence is fabricated," Abigail stated, her voice ringing with a certainty that startled the room into silence. "And I can prove it." For the first time, a flicker of something other than arrogance crossed the judge's face. It was annoyance, tinged with a sliver of curiosity. He looked at the prosecutor, a slick, well-dressed man named Henderson, who simply shrugged, as if this was all a ridiculous waste of time. Very well, Miss Vance, the judge said, his voice laced with mock indulgence. You have 5 minutes to entertain us with your proof. Then, I want you and your thieving mother out of my sight. Abigail gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Thank you, Your Honor. I won't need 5 minutes. She turned her head slightly, her eyes scanning the prosecution's table, where a collection of evidence bags were neatly arranged. Her gaze then shifted to the jury, her expression softening with a plea for reason. The prosecution claims my mother stole the Star of the South, a diamond necklace, from Mrs. Wallace's locked jewelry box. Abigail began, her voice steady and clear, each word carefully chosen. They have presented testimony from Mrs. Wallace, who claims she saw my mother in her bedroom on the night of the theft. They also have a security guard who will testify to seeing my mother leave the premises late that night. And, of course, they have the necklace itself, which they miraculously found in a shoebox under my mother's bed. She paused, letting the weight of the seemingly damning evidence settle in the room. Judge Wallace tapped his fingers impatiently on his gavel. Your point, Miss Vance, he snapped. My point, Your Honor, Abigail continued, turning her sharp gaze back to him, is that this is a very well-constructed story. But like all stories, it has a plot hole. A very big one. She took a step closer to the bar, her eyes locking with the judge's. The prosecution has built its entire case on the idea that my mother, a woman with no criminal record, a woman who has faithfully served your family for 2 decades, suddenly decided to become a master jewel thief. But they overlooked one small detail. Something so obvious, it's almost embarrassing. Abigail's voice dropped, becoming a near whisper, yet it carried to every corner of the silent courtroom. The Star of the South diamond has a very famous flaw. A tiny, feather-like inclusion near the clasp. It's what makes it unique. It's been documented in every appraisal since it was first cut in the 19th century. She then raised her voice, her words sharp and accusatory. The necklace in that evidence bag, the one you found in my mother's apartment, is a fake. A very good one, but a fake nonetheless. It doesn't have the flaw. The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. Judge Wallace's face, which had been a mask of arrogant boredom, was now a canvas of stunned disbelief. Prosecutor Henderson shot to his feet, his face flushed. Objection, Your Honor. This is baseless speculation. This girl has no expertise in gemology. I don't need to be a gemologist, Mr. Henderson, Abigail shot back, her voice like steel. I just need to have paid attention. She turned back to the judge. Your Honor, my great-grandfather was Sergeant Michael O'Connell, a decorated war hero who, after the war, became one of the country's most respected jewelers. He taught my mother, and my mother taught me, everything there is to know about precious stones. I've seen the real Star of the South dozens of times when my mother was cleaning it. I know it like the back of my hand. The mention of Sergeant O'Connell, a legendary name in their city, a man known for his unwavering integrity, sent another shockwave through the room. The whispers grew louder. Judge Wallace, for the first time in his long and storied career, looked utterly speechless. His gavel hand was frozen in midair. Bring me the necklace, he finally croaked, his voice hoarse. A bailiff, his face a mixture of confusion and awe, carried the evidence bag to the bench. The judge fumbled with the clasp, his hands shaking slightly. He pulled out a jeweler's loupe from his pocket, a habit from his own wealthy upbringing, and examined the diamond. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. You could hear a pin drop. After a long, tense moment, Judge Wallace slowly lowered the loupe. His face was ashen. He stared at Abigail, his eyes wide with a mixture of fury and a dawning, horrifying understanding. She was right. The flaw was missing. The necklace was a fake. The carefully constructed case against Eleanor Vance had just been blown to pieces by a 17-year-old girl with blonde hair and a secret legacy. And in that moment, everyone in the courtroom knew 2 things. An innocent woman had been framed, and a powerful judge had been caught in a lie. The show they had come to see had just taken a very unexpected and very dangerous turn. The courtroom remained in a state of suspended animation for a full 30 seconds. The only sound was the frantic rustling of paper as Prosecutor Henderson, his face now a ghastly shade of pale, tried to find some document, some piece of information that could salvage his imploding case. Judge Wallace, however, was unnervingly still. He stared at the fake necklace lying on his bench as if it were a venomous snake. The arrogance had evaporated from his features, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. He finally raised his head, his eyes, like chips of ice, locking onto Abigail. "An interesting theory, Miss Vance," he said, his voice dangerously low. "A convenient one. You claim to have this inherited knowledge. But how do we know you didn't switch the real necklace with this imitation to protect your mother?" The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. It was a desperate, vicious gambit, and it showed just how cornered the judge felt. Abigail didn't flinch. She had anticipated this. "With all due respect, Your Honor, that's a question you should be asking your own wife." "My wife?" Wallace roared, slamming his hand on the bench. "You will not bring my wife into this." "I'm afraid I must," Abigail replied, her tone respectful but firm. "Mrs. Wallace was the last person to handle the necklace. She's the one who placed it in the jewelry box. A box, I might add, that requires a key. A key that Mrs. Wallace and yourself are the only two people to possess." "Objection!" Henderson shouted, finding his voice again. "The witness is making wild, unsubstantiated accusations. I am merely pointing out the logistical inconsistencies in your case, Mr. Henderson," Abigail countered smoothly. She turned her attention to the jury box, where 12 pairs of eyes were now wide with intrigue. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the prosecution's narrative asks you to believe that my mother, Eleanor Vance, somehow bypassed a locked door to a master suite, cracked open a locked jewelry box without leaving a single scratch, stole a necklace, and then relocked everything perfectly. All without anyone hearing a thing. Does that sound like the work of a maid, or the work of someone who had easy access to the room and the key?" She let the question hang, her gaze sweeping over the jurors, making eye contact with each one. She saw the doubt beginning to blossom on their faces. "Furthermore," Abigail continued, "if my mother was the thief, why would she hide a fake necklace in her own apartment? It makes no sense. The only person who would benefit from having a replica made is someone who wanted to sell the real one and replace it with a convincing fake, hoping no one would notice for months or even years." Judge Wallace's face was a thundercloud. "That is enough. Bailiff, remove this girl from my courtroom." "You can't do that, Your Honor," Abigail said, her voice rising in volume and authority. "I am acting as my mother's counsel. To remove me would be to deny her the right to a fair defense. A right, I might add, that is being severely compromised by your blatant conflict of interest in presiding over this case in the first place." The direct challenge to his authority, to his very integrity, left the judge momentarily stunned. No one had ever dared to speak to him this way, let alone a teenager. The reporters in the gallery were scribbling furiously in their notepads. This was no longer just a local theft case. It was becoming a major scandal. "I demand an immediate examination of this necklace by an independent, certified gemologist," Abigail declared, her voice ringing through the hall. "And I also petition for a mistrial, on the grounds of judicial misconduct and clear evidence tampering." "Denied," Wallace bellowed, his face turning a deep, dangerous shade of red. "All of it denied. This sideshow is over. It's only just beginning," Abigail said, her voice dropping back to a calm, determined tone. She reached into the simple, worn briefcase she had set down beside her and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "This is a sworn affidavit from Mr. Julian Reed, of Reed & Sons Jewelers, the most respected gem appraisal firm in this city. It is dated 3 months ago. In it, he states that he was hired by Mrs. Agatha Wallace to create a flawless replica of the Star of the South diamond necklace. He also states that she paid him in cash and was most insistent on secrecy." Abigail walked calmly to the prosecutor's table and placed the affidavit down in front of the stunned Mr. Henderson. "I believe this is what you call evidence, Mr. Henderson. Or would you like to call Mr. Reed to the stand? I have his number right here." The courtroom was in an uproar. Shouts and gasps echoed off the marble walls. Prosecutor Henderson looked at the affidavit as if it were a death warrant. He looked at Judge Wallace, his eyes pleading for some kind of direction, but the judge was no longer looking at him. His gaze was fixed on the back of the room, where his wife, Agatha Wallace, had just risen from her seat, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. Judge Wallace slammed his gavel down, again and again, the sound like gunshots in the chaotic room. "Order! Order in this court. This court is in recess." 10 minutes, he yelled, his voice cracking under the strain. He then rose so quickly his chair screeched backwards, and he all but fled through the door to his private chambers, his black robes billowing behind him like the wings of a wounded bird. Abigail stood her ground in the center of the storm, a small island of calm in a sea of chaos. She walked over to her mother, who was now sobbing with a mixture of terror and overwhelming relief, and wrapped her arms around her. "It's okay, Mom," Abigail whispered, her own heart pounding in her chest. "It's going to be okay. I told you I wouldn't let them do this to you." Eleanor looked at her daughter, her eyes filled with a love and admiration so profound it was heartbreaking. "Oh, my baby," she cried softly. "My brilliant, brave baby. What have you done?" "What I had to do," Abigail said, her jaw set with a determination that made her look far older than her 17 years. Across the room, Mr. Peterson, the young public defender, stared at Abigail with his mouth agape. He had been a lawyer for 2 years and had never seen anything like it. He had been prepared to lose this case, to see an innocent woman railroaded by a corrupt system. He had underestimated Eleanor Vance's daughter. Everyone had. The 10-minute recess stretched into 20, then 30. The buzz in the courtroom didn't die down. It intensified with each passing moment. Reporters were huddled together, speaking in hushed, excited tones. The spectators, who had come for a simple public shaming, were now witnesses to the potential downfall of the city's most powerful judge. Abigail sat with her mother, holding her hand, speaking to her in low, reassuring tones. She ignored the stares and the whispers. Her focus was singular, justice for her mother. She knew this was far from over. She had won the battle, but the war was just beginning. Judge Wallace was not a man who would go down without a fight. He was a wounded animal now, and that made him more dangerous than ever. Finally, the door to the judge's chambers creaked open. A bailiff stepped out, his face grim. "All rise," he announced, his voice lacking its usual conviction. Judge Wallace re-entered the courtroom. The flush of anger had been replaced by an unnerving, icy calm. His eyes were cold and hard as he surveyed the room, and when they landed on Abigail, they held a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. He took his seat, cleared his throat, and spoke, his voice devoid of all emotion. "This court will come to order," he said, his words clipped and precise. "In light of the unexpected developments and the introduction of new potential evidence, this court will grant a continuance. This case is hereby postponed for 1 week to allow both the prosecution and the defense to review this new information." It was a strategic retreat, not a surrender. He was buying time. Time to formulate a new plan, time to bury the evidence, time to crush this teenage girl who had dared to defy him. Furthermore, the judge continued, his gaze still locked on Abigail. "Given the personal nature of this case, I will be recusing myself. A new judge will be assigned to oversee the remainder of these proceedings." A wave of murmurs swept through the room. Recusal was an admission of guilt, a public acknowledgement of the conflict of interest Abigail had so boldly pointed out. It was a major victory. However, Judge Wallace added, a cruel smile twisting his lips, "Before I do so, there is one last piece of business to attend to." He paused for dramatic effect, letting the tension build. "Miss Abigail Vance, for your unauthorized practice of law, for your contemptuous behavior in this court, and for your slanderous accusations against a sitting judge and his family, I hereby find you in contempt of court." Gasps of outrage filled the room. Eleanor screamed, "No!" The judge's smile widened. "Bailiff, take the girl into custody. She will spend the next 48 hours in a holding cell to reflect on the consequences of her actions. This court is adjourned." With a final, triumphant slam of his gavel, Judge Wallace rose and strode out of the courtroom, leaving chaos and devastation in his wake. 2 burly bailiffs approached Abigail, their expressions apologetic but firm. Her mother was hysterical, held back by Mr. Peterson. But Abigail did not cry. She did not struggle. As the bailiffs gently took her arms, she looked back at her weeping mother and gave her a small, reassuring nod. Her eyes were clear, and her face was a mask of cold, hard resolve. This was not a defeat. It was a declaration of war. And Judge Wallace was about to find out that Sergeant Michael O'Connell's great-granddaughter did not back down from a fight. The fluorescent lights of the county jail's holding cell hummed with a monotonous, soul-crushing buzz. The air was thick with the smell of disinfectant and despair. A thin, plastic-covered mattress lay on a concrete slab, and a single, lidless toilet sat in the corner with a shocking lack of privacy. For most people, this would be a place of terror and humiliation. For Abigail Vance, it was a war room. She sat on the edge of the slab, not with the slumped posture of a victim, but with the ramrod straight back of a soldier. She was not afraid. She was angry, and her anger was a cold, clear, and focused thing. Judge Wallace had made a critical error. He thought locking her away would break her, silence her. He had, in fact, given her the one thing she needed most: time to think, away from the chaos and the cameras, in a place where no one could bother her. Her mind was a whirlwind of legal strategy. The affidavit from the jeweler was her ace, but Wallace would be working overtime to discredit Mr. Reed, to paint him as a liar or a senile old man. He would use his immense power and influence to pressure the district attorney's office, to twist the narrative, to bury the truth under a mountain of legal obfuscation. Abigail knew she couldn't rely on that one piece of evidence alone. She needed more. She needed to find the real necklace. A key scraped in the lock, and the heavy steel door creaked open. A female guard, a stern-looking woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, escorted another woman into the cell. The newcomer was older, perhaps in her early 50s, with a face etched with worry and exhaustion. She clutched a tattered purse to her chest like a life raft. "You've got company," the guard grunted, slamming the door shut. The sound echoed with a grim finality. The woman flinched at the noise and slid down the wall to the floor, pulling her knees to her chest. She glanced at Abigail, her eyes filled with a weary, defeated sadness. "First time?" the woman asked, her voice raspy. Abigail simply nodded. "You'll get used to the noise," the woman said with a sigh. "It's the silence you gotta worry about." She offered a small, crooked smile. "Name's Martha." "Abigail," she replied. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the incessant hum of the lights. "What are you in for?" Martha finally asked, her curiosity getting the better of her. "You don't look like the usual type we get in here." "Contempt of court," Abigail said. Martha raised an eyebrow. "Talk back to a judge, huh? Who is it?" "Don't tell me." "Wallace." Abigail's eyes sharpened. "You know him?" Martha let out a short, bitter laugh. "Oh, I know him. Everybody who's ever been in the gutter in this city knows Judge Wallace. He's the one who kicks you back down if you ever try to climb out." She hugged her knees tighter. "My son, my boy, Danny. He got mixed up with the wrong crowd. Made a stupid mistake. First offense, a minor possession charge. Any other judge, he would have gotten probation, maybe some community service. But we got Wallace. He sentenced my boy to 5 years. 5 years for a handful of pills. Sent him to a maximum security prison with murderers and hardened criminals. My Danny, he's not a bad kid. He's just lost. And that judge, he threw him away like he was garbage." Tears streamed down Martha's face, silent and hot. "I stood up in court. I begged him. I told him my boy needed help, not a cage. He banged that gavel and told me one more word, and I'd be joining my son. That was 2 years ago. I've been fighting ever since. Filing appeals, writing letters. Today, I was protesting outside the courthouse. Peacefully, just holding a sign. They arrested me for loitering." Abigail listened, her cold anger solidifying into something harder, something more righteous. This wasn't just about her mother anymore. It was about Martha. It was about Danny. It was about every person who had been crushed under the heel of Judge Wallace's corrupt version of justice. "I'm going to stop him, Martha," Abigail said, her voice quiet but filled with an unshakable conviction. Martha looked at the young girl, at the fierce determination in her blue eyes. For the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of something she thought she had lost forever: hope. Outside the jail, the city was in an uproar. The story of the teenage girl who had single-handedly exposed a corrupt judge had exploded. News vans were camped outside the courthouse and the jail. Headlines screamed from every newspaper stand. Teen prodigy accuses judge of frame-up, and the Maid's daughter. David versus Goliath in Wallace's courtroom. Eleanor Vance, now out on bail that had been posted by an anonymous benefactor, was sequestered in Mr. Peterson's small, cluttered office. She was a wreck, alternating between fits of weeping for her daughter's safety and bursts of pride for her courage. "I don't understand, Mr. Peterson," she said, wringing her hands. How can he do that? How can he just lock her up? Mr. Peterson, who was rapidly beginning to feel like he was in way over his head, tried to sound reassuring. Contempt of court is a direct challenge to the judge's authority, Eleanor. And Judge Wallace, his authority is everything to him. He's lashing out. But it's a mistake. It makes him look like a bully. It makes Abigail look like a martyr. His phone rang, for what felt like the 100th time that day. It was a well-known civil rights attorney from the city's most prestigious law firm. Mr. Peterson, the smooth, confident voice on the other end said, "My name is Samuel Thorne. I've been following the Vance case with great interest. My firm would like to offer our services, pro bono, to both you and Miss Vance. What that young lady did today, it took a kind of courage I haven't seen in a very long time. We want to help." Peterson was floored. Samuel Thorne was a legal legend. With Thorne and his firm on their side, they actually had a fighting chance. "Yes," Peterson stammered. "Yes, Mr. Thorne. We would be honored." The tide was beginning to turn. Judge Wallace had overplayed his hand. His act of petty vengeance against Abigail had galvanized the public and attracted powerful allies to her cause. Meanwhile, in the Wallace mansion, a different kind of drama was unfolding. Agatha Wallace, a woman who usually moved with the serene grace of a pampered swan, was pacing her bedroom like a caged animal. Her face was pale, her hands trembled, and she kept glancing at the phone, as if expecting it to ring and pronounce her doom. "What were you thinking, Agatha?" Her husband's voice, cold and sharp, cut through her panic. Judge Wallace stood in the doorway, his face a mask of controlled fury. He had just returned from a tense meeting with the district attorney, a man he had mentored and controlled for years, who had suddenly started asking uncomfortable questions. I didn't think." She stammered. "No, you didn't think," he roared, striding into the room. "You never think. You and your gambling debts, your secret trips to the casino, your lies. Did you really think you could sell the Star of the South, a family heirloom, and I wouldn't find out? I was going to win it back," she cried, her voice thin and reedy. "I had a system. I just needed a bigger stake. I was going to replace the necklace before you ever knew it was gone." "You fool," he spat, his face inches from hers. "You absolute, utter fool. And to frame the maid, the one person who has been nothing but loyal to this family for 20 years? You've brought this family to the brink of ruin. You're the one who insisted on presiding over the case," she shot back, a spark of defiance in her eyes. "You're the one who was so arrogant. You thought you could railroad an innocent woman without anyone blinking an eye. This is as much your fault as it is mine." The slap was so sudden, so sharp, it echoed in the cavernous room. Agatha stumbled back, her hand flying to her cheek, her eyes wide with shock and pain. "Do not," Judge Wallace hissed, his voice a venomous whisper, "ever presume to put yourself on my level. I have spent a lifetime building my reputation, my power. I will not let you, or some insolent child, tear it down. Now, you will do exactly as I say. You will call your jeweler friend, Mr. Reed, and you will convince him to retract his statement. You will tell him you were mistaken, that you were having a replica made for insurance purposes, and that the girl must have misunderstood. You will fix this, Agatha, or I swear to you, I will personally see you in a cell next to the maid you tried to destroy." Agatha stared at her husband, at the cold, cruel stranger she had been married to for 30 years. The fear she felt was no longer just for herself, but for what he was capable of. She nodded, tears of shame and terror rolling down her face. She had made a deal with the devil, and now he was coming to collect. 48 hours later, Abigail Vance was released. She emerged from the jail, not into the arms of her mother, but into a blinding sea of flashing camera bulbs and shouting reporters. A path was cleared for her by her new legal team, led by the imposing and impeccably dressed Samuel Thorne. Mr. Peterson was there too, looking both overwhelmed and immensely relieved. They hustled her into a waiting black car. Her mother was in the back seat, and they embraced in a fierce, tearful hug. "I was so worried," Eleanor sobbed. "I'm fine, Mom," Abigail said, pulling back to look at her. "Are you okay?" "I am now," Eleanor said, wiping her eyes. Samuel Thorne turned in the front passenger seat to face them. "Abigail," he said, his voice a deep, reassuring baritone, "I'm Samuel Thorne. I want you to know you're not alone in this anymore. We're going to fight this, and we're going to win." Abigail looked at the powerful man, at his kind, intelligent eyes, and felt a surge of gratitude. But her resolve had not softened. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne. But there's something I have to do. Something I figured out while I was away." "What is it?" he asked. "Mrs. Wallace didn't just sell the necklace," Abigail said, her mind working with a crystalline clarity. "She's a gambler. A serious one. She has debts. That's why she needed the money. And people who have serious gambling debts, they don't sell to reputable dealers. They go to pawn shops, to underground brokers. People who don't ask questions." Thorne and Peterson exchanged a look. They had been focused on the legal battle, on discrediting the judge. They hadn't considered the street-level investigation. "She wouldn't have sold it in the city," Abigail continued, thinking out loud. "Too risky. She would have gone somewhere close, but out of her usual social circle. A place where she wouldn't be recognized." "Atlantic City," Thorne breathed, the realization dawning on him. "It's only a 3-hour drive." "Exactly," Abigail said, her eyes gleaming with a strategic light. "Judge Wallace is trying to clean up his wife's mess, trying to silence the jeweler and bury the evidence. He thinks he's fighting us in the courtroom. But the real fight, the real evidence, it's not in a law library. It's in a pawn shop in Atlantic City. And we're going to find it before he does." Thorne stared at the 17-year-old girl. She had just spent 2 days in jail, had been publicly humiliated by a powerful judge, and she wasn't just unbowed. She was on the attack. She wasn't just a client. She was a general. And he, one of the best lawyers in the country, was ready to follow her lead. The case of the stolen necklace was about to become a manhunt, and the prize was not just a piece of jewelry, but the very soul of justice in their city. The 3-hour drive to Atlantic City was a blur of highway and muted conversations. The sleek black car, courtesy of Samuel Thorne's firm, was a world away from the city bus Abigail was used to. Inside, a council of war was in session. Eleanor, exhausted from the emotional whiplash of the past few days, had dozed off, her head resting on her daughter's shoulder. In the front, Thorne drove with a quiet focus, while Mr. Peterson sat in the passenger seat, a laptop open, furiously researching pawn shops and known fences in the Atlantic City area. "There are over 50 licensed pawn shops in the city limits," Peterson said, his brow furrowed in concentration. "And that's not counting the unlicensed ones." She could have gone to any of them. Abigail, gently stroking her mother's hair, spoke without looking up. She wouldn't have gone to a big one on the main strip. Too many cameras, too many questions. She'd want a place that was established, but quiet. A place known for discretion. Probably family-owned, where the owner makes the decisions and values a cash deal over paperwork. Thorne glanced at her in the rearview mirror, a small, impressed smile on his face. "You've given this a lot of thought." 2 days in a cell gives you a lot of time to think," Abigail replied dryly. "Mrs. Wallace is arrogant, but she isn't stupid. She's also a creature of habit and luxury. She wouldn't go to a complete dive. It would have to be a place that, at least on the surface, looked reputable. Old world, maybe. A place that deals in high-end antiques and estate jewelry, not just stolen TVs and power tools." Peterson's fingers flew across the keyboard. He filtered his search results based on Abigail's criteria. The list of 50 shops narrowed to 10, then 5, then 3. "Okay. There's Golden Treasures, The Gilded Cage, and Salvatore's Curios and Fine Gems." Salvatore's, known as Sal's, has been around for 60 years. Specializes in vintage jewelry. The owner, Sal Genovese, took it over from his father. Low profile, but stellar reputation among collectors for finding rare pieces. "That's the one," Abigail said with a certainty that left no room for argument. "That's where we're going." They entered Atlantic City not through the glittering facade of the main boardwalk, but through the back streets, where the salt and sea air had weathered the buildings and the neon signs seemed a little dimmer, a little more tired. Sal's was a relic from a bygone era, a narrow brick building squeezed between a modern vape shop and a boarded-up diner. The windows were filled with tarnished silver tea sets, oil paintings with cracked varnish, and a few discreetly displayed pieces of jewelry resting on faded velvet. It was exactly as Abigail had pictured. Thorne parked the car a block away. "Okay," he said, turning to face them. "Let's be smart about this. I'm a lawyer, Peterson is a lawyer. If we go in there flashing badges and making demands, he'll clam up. Abigail, you have the knowledge, but you're a minor. Sal has no legal obligation to speak to you. So what do we do?" Peterson asked. We go in as customers, Abigail said, her eyes fixed on the shop's front door. My mother and I, we're looking to sell some old family jewelry. You and Mr. Thorne wait in the car. If we need you, I'll text. Thorne hesitated. It could be dangerous. More dangerous than letting Judge Wallace get to him first. Abigail countered. She gently shook her mother awake. Mom, I need you. We're going to go into that shop. Just follow my lead. Eleanor, still groggy, nodded, her trust in her daughter absolute. They got out of the car, two ordinary women on an ordinary errand, and walked towards the shop. The bell above the door chimed a quaint, old-fashioned sound as they entered. The inside of the shop was a treasure trove of forgotten histories. It was cluttered but clean, smelling of old paper and wood polish. A man stood behind a heavy oak counter, polishing a silver locket with a soft cloth. He was in his late 60s, with a thick head of white hair, a formidable Roman nose, and eyes that were sharp and assessing. He looked up as they entered, his gaze lingering for a moment on Abigail before settling on Eleanor. Can I help you, ladies? He asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Yes, Eleanor began, her voice a little shaky. She opened her purse and took out a small, velvet pouch. Inside was a pair of her own mother's pearl earrings. Not valuable, but respectable. We were looking to sell these. The man, presumably Sal, took the earrings and examined them under his jeweler's loupe. He was professional, his movements precise. Nice quality. Simple, classic. I can give you $200 for the pair. That seems fair, Eleanor said, relieved. As Sal counted out the money, Abigail let her gaze wander around the shop. Her eyes scanned the display cases, filled with rings, brooches, and bracelets. She wasn't just looking at the jewelry. She was analyzing it, categorizing it, absorbing the style and quality of the pieces Sal dealt in. You have a good eye for quality, Abigail said, her voice catching Sal's attention. He looked up, surprised that she was speaking to him. That Victorian mourning brooch, for example, jet and seed pearls. Most people would overlook it, but the craftsmanship is exquisite. Sal's professional demeanor softened slightly. He was clearly impressed by her knowledge. You know your jewelry, kid. My great-grandfather taught me, Abigail said, her voice casual, but her eyes were locked on his. Sergeant Michael O'Connell. The name landed like a stone in a still pond. Sal froze, the cash still in his hand. He slowly lowered the money to the counter and stared at Abigail, his sharp eyes searching her face. A flicker of recognition, of memory, passed through them. Mickey O'Connell? Sal said, his voice barely a whisper. The Mickey O'Connell? From the old neighborhood? The man who could spot a fake diamond from across the street in the pouring rain. That's him, Abigail said with a small smile. Sal leaned against the counter, shaking his head in disbelief. I'll be damned. I haven't heard that name in 30 years. He was a legend, a straight shooter, one of the few honest men in a business full of sharks. I was just a kid when he retired, but my father worshipped him. Said Mickey O'Connell's word was better than a signed contract. He looked from Abigail to Eleanor and back again. You're his family? He was my grandfather, Eleanor said softly. And my great-grandfather, Abigail added. And we need your help, Mr. Genovese. We need an honest man. Sal's guard was back up in an instant. His eyes narrowed. I'm a businessman, not a charity. What kind of help? A woman came in here about 3 months ago, Abigail said, lowering her voice. Wealthy. Panicked. She had a diamond necklace to sell. A very famous one. The Star of the South. Sal's face became an unreadable mask. He turned away and began arranging some items on a shelf, his back to them. Never heard of it. Mr. Genovese. Abigail pressed, her voice firm but respectful. This woman, she framed my mother for the theft of that necklace. My mother, Eleanor Vance, has spent her whole life working for this woman's family. Now, they're trying to send her to prison to cover up their own crimes. My great-grandfather, he wouldn't have stood for that. He believed in justice. He believed that a good name was worth more than all the gems in the world. Sal stopped his shuffling. He stood with his back to them for a long, silent moment. The only sound was the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Finally, he turned around. His face was grim. You're putting me in a bad spot, kid, he said, his voice low. The woman you're talking about, she wasn't just any customer. She had powerful friends. And the man she sold the necklace to, he's not the kind of person you want to cross. Who was it? Abigail asked. Sal hesitated, looking towards the front door as if expecting trouble to walk in at any moment. She didn't sell it to me. I just brokered the deal. The buyer was a man named Frankie the Fish Caruso. A chill went down Abigail's spine. She didn't need Mr. Peterson's laptop to know that name. Frankie Caruso was a notorious mob boss, a man who ran the city's underground gambling and loan sharking operations. He was a ghost, a man the police had been trying to pin something on for years, with no success. Why would Mrs. Wallace sell a priceless necklace to a mobster? Eleanor whispered, horrified. Because she owed him, Sal explained, his voice heavy with resignation. She owed him a lot. The necklace didn't even cover her full debt. She was in deep, ladies. Deeper than you can imagine. This changed everything. The necklace wasn't just a piece of evidence anymore. It was leverage. It was tied to the criminal underworld. And it was in the hands of a man far more dangerous than Judge Wallace. Can you help us, Mr. Genovese? Abigail pleaded. Can you tell us how to find Caruso? Or at least, testify to what you saw? Sal let out a long, weary sigh. Testify? Against Frankie Caruso? Kid, that's a death sentence. I've got a family. I can't do it. He saw the despair on their faces, and his own expression softened with a touch of pity. Look, I'm sorry for your trouble. Your great-grandfather was a good man. But this is out of my league. Just then, the bell on the door chimed again. Two large men in expensive-looking suits walked in. They didn't look like customers. Their eyes were cold, and they moved with a predatory stillness. They flanked the door, their presence instantly changing the atmosphere in the shop, charging it with a silent, menacing energy. One of the men looked at Sal. Sal, he said, his voice flat and hard. Someone's been asking questions about you. A judge. From up north. We need to have a talk. Sal's face went pale. He looked at Abigail and Eleanor, his eyes wide with fear. Judge Wallace's reach was long. He wasn't just using the law to cover his tracks. He was using the city's criminal element. The other man's gaze fell on Abigail. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. Well, look what we have here. You must be the little girl who's been causing so much trouble. Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs, but she stood her ground, placing herself slightly in front of her mother. She subtly reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around her phone. With a practiced movement, she sent a single, pre-written text message, a simple SOS. Outside in the car, Thorne's phone buzzed. He looked at the message, and his blood ran cold. He and Peterson were out of the car in a second, their faces set with grim determination as they strode towards the pawn shop, the pleasantries of their legal profession stripped away to reveal a raw, protective instinct. The search for the truth had just turned into a rescue mission. The moment before Samuel Thorne and Mr. Peterson burst through the door was a study in suspended time. The air in Sal's shop was thick with unspoken threats. The two thugs moved with a practiced, casual menace, separating Abigail from the door and her mother from the counter. Sal stood frozen behind his display case, a man caught between a rock and a legion of hard places. The taller of the two goons, the one who had smiled at Abigail, took a step towards her. The judge doesn't like loose ends, he said, his voice a low purr that was more frightening than a shout. And you, little girl, are the loosest end I've ever seen. Abigail's mind raced. She stood her ground, her body a shield for her terrified mother. She had to keep him talking. She had to buy time. The judge is a desperate man, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt in her bones. Using criminals to clean up his mess. That's not power. That's weakness. The man's smile faltered. He was not used to being analyzed, especially by his intended victims. You've got a mouth on you. I'm going to enjoy shutting it. He reached for her. At that exact second, the door flew open with such force that the little bell above it was ripped from its hinge. Samuel Thorne filled the doorway, his large frame radiating an authority that had nothing to do with physical size and everything to do with decades of commanding courtrooms and boardrooms. Mr. Peterson was right behind him, phone in hand, already dialing 911. Get your hands off my client. Thorne's voice was a deep, resonant boom that seemed to shake the very foundations of the old shop. The two thugs were momentarily stunned, their intimidation tactics useless against a man who was utterly unintimidated. The tall one recovered first, a sneer twisting his lips. Client, this is a private conversation. I suggest you lawyers go chase an ambulance. I'm on the phone with the Atlantic City Police Department right now, Peterson announced, his voice surprisingly firm. I'm reporting an attempted assault and kidnapping at this address. They'd be very interested to know that 2 associates of Frankie Caruso are here, harassing witnesses in a federal investigation. The mention of a federal investigation was a calculated bluff, but a brilliant one. It raised the stakes beyond a simple strong-arm tactic. The second thug, who had been silent until now, shot a nervous glance at his partner. This was getting complicated, attracting the wrong kind of attention. There's no need for any of that, a new voice said. It came from the back of the shop, from a doorway hidden by a curtain of dusty velvet. A man stepped out. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored silk suit, his silver hair slicked back. He was older, perhaps in his late 60s, but he moved with a quiet, dangerous grace. His eyes, a pale, piercing blue, held a chilling emptiness. It was Frankie the Fish Caruso. He surveyed the scene with a look of mild disappointment, as if he had walked in on his employees making a mess. "Sal," he said, his voice soft, almost gentle. "You have guests. You should have told me." He then turned his unervingly calm gaze on Abigail. "You must be the girl, the one who has caused my business associate so much distress." "Your business associate is a corrupt judge who framed an innocent woman," Abigail shot back, her fear eclipsed by a wave of righteous indignation. Caruso actually smiled, a thin, bloodless stretching of his lips. "Corruption is a matter of perspective. One man's crime is another man's cost of doing business." He looked at Thorne. "Mr. Thorne, it's a pleasure. I've read about your work. You are a very expensive man. It's a shame to see you wasting your talents on such a proletarian case." "Justice is never a waste of my time, Mr. Caruso," Thorne replied, his tone as cold and hard as granite. "And my clients are now under my protection. So, I suggest you call off your dogs, and we can all walk out of here before this escalates." Caruso considered this for a moment, his blue eyes moving from Thorne to Abigail, and finally to Sal, who looked as if he was about to have a heart attack. Caruso knew the game. A public scene with a high-profile lawyer was bad for business. He had other, quieter ways of dealing with problems. "Very well," he said with a sigh, as if conceding a minor point in a friendly debate. He nodded to his men. "Let them go." He then locked eyes with Abigail one last time. "It has been enlightening to meet you, Miss Vance. You have a fire in you. Be careful it doesn't consume you." With that, he and his men turned and walked out of the shop. The bell, lying broken on the floor, was crushed under their feet as they left. The tension in the shop deflated like a punctured lung. Eleanor sagged against the counter, sobbing with relief. Peterson finished his call with the police, giving them a description of the men. Samuel Thorne put a reassuring hand on Abigail's shoulder. "Are you all right?" he asked. Abigail nodded, though she was shaking. "I am now." All eyes turned to Sal. The pawn shop owner was pale and trembling, his face slick with a cold sweat. He looked at the broken bell on the floor, at the family of the man his father had revered, and a lifetime of looking the other way, of minding his own business, came to a crashing halt. The mobster's threat had been designed to ensure his silence, but it had had the opposite effect. It had pushed him past his fear and into a place of quiet, simmering rage. "That man, that animal, he thinks he owns this city. He thinks he owns me," Sal whispered, his voice shaking with fury. He looked at Abigail, his eyes filled with a new resolve. "Your great-grandfather, Mickey O'Connell, he would have spit in that man's eye." Sal walked over to the grandfather clock in the corner. He didn't open its face, but instead ran his hand along the side, pressing a hidden latch. A small, concealed panel popped open. From inside, he withdrew a small, leather-bound ledger and a tiny, almost unnoticeable object, a micro SD card. "I may be a businessman, but I'm not a fool," Sal said, his voice growing stronger. "I don't deal with men like Caruso without an insurance policy. Every high-value transaction, every shady deal that happens in this shop, it's recorded." He tapped the SD card. "High-resolution audio and video. The camera is hidden in that old lamp up there." He pointed to a dusty Tiffany-style lamp hanging directly over the counter. It caught the whole thing. Mrs. Wallace selling the necklace. Her admitting to her gambling debts. The whole sordid story. He then pushed the ledger across the counter to Abigail. "And this is the old-fashioned way." Every detail of the transaction is in here. Date, time, item description, price paid, and the buyer. Frankie Caruso. It was the smoking gun. It was more than a smoking gun. It was a cannon. It was irrefutable proof that would not only exonerate Eleanor, but would directly link Judge Wallace's wife to a notorious mob boss. Samuel Thorne looked at the evidence, his lawyer's mind already calculating the fallout. Mr. Genovese. Sal, you realize what you're doing. Testifying to this, providing this evidence, they will come after you. Let them come, Sal said, his jaw set. He looked at Abigail, a sad smile on his face. It's been a long time since I did something my father would have been proud of. It's about time I honored his memory. And the memory of Mickey O'Connell. He held out the SD card and the ledger to Abigail. Here, kid, go finish this. For your mother. And for all the people those monsters have hurt. 1 week later, the courtroom was a circus. The new judge, a stern but fair woman named Judge Carol Esposito, presided over a room packed to the rafters with reporters, lawyers, and curious citizens. Judge Wallace was not on the bench. He was sitting at the defense table next to his wife, Agatha, both looking pale and drawn. Their high-priced legal team looked tense and beleaguered. The prosecution, now led by a special prosecutor from the state attorney's office, had dropped all charges against Eleanor Vance. The trial was now a preliminary hearing to determine if there was enough evidence to charge Judge Wallace and his wife with obstruction of justice, perjury, and conspiracy. The star witness was Abigail Vance. When she took the stand, a hush fell over the courtroom. She was no longer the frightened girl in a second-hand blazer. She was dressed in a simple but elegant dark blue dress, her blonde hair pulled back neatly. She looked poised, confident, and utterly in control. For 2 hours, with the special prosecutor guiding her, she laid out the entire story, from the moment she heard her mother being accused to the terrifying confrontation in the Atlantic City pawn shop. She was clear, concise, and unshakable. She presented the jeweler's affidavit, Sal's ledger, and then the master stroke, the video from the pawn shop. It was played on a large screen for the entire court to see. The grainy but clear footage showed Agatha Wallace, haggard and desperate, sliding the famous Star of the South necklace across the counter. Her voice, caught by the hidden microphone, was clear. I don't care what you give me, Sal, I just need the cash. Frankie's guys, they're going to break my legs. The video then showed the transaction with Caruso, the cold exchange of a priceless heirloom for a stack of cash that was then immediately handed back to the mobster to settle a debt. The courtroom was in an uproar. Agatha Wallace collapsed into sobs, her carefully constructed facade shattering into a million pieces. Judge Wallace sat ramrod straight, his face a stony mask, but a muscle twitched uncontrollably in his jaw. He was finished. His career was over. His reputation was in ashes. And he knew it. His lawyer, a man known for his aggressive cross-examinations, approached Abigail with a weary resignation. He had nothing to fight with. The evidence was absolute. He asked a few perfunctory questions, trying to poke holes in her story, but it was like trying to punch through a brick wall. Miss Vance, he said finally, his tone almost pleading. You are 17 years old. You have no formal legal training. How could you possibly have orchestrated such a complex investigation? Abigail looked not at the lawyer, but at the jury, and then at Judge Esposito. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, but it carried the weight of her entire journey. You're right, sir. I'm not a lawyer, she said, but I love my mother, and I believe in the truth. It turns out, when you have those two things on your side, you don't need a law degree. You just need the courage to fight for them. Her words hung in the silent courtroom, a simple, powerful testament that resonated more than any legal argument could. In the end, it was a swift and decisive victory. Judge Esposito ruled that there was overwhelming evidence to proceed with a criminal trial against the Wallaces. They were taken into custody, their faces a mixture of disbelief and shame, as the flashes of news cameras documented their fall from grace. Outside the courthouse, Abigail stood with her mother, Samuel Thorne, and a beaming Mr. Peterson. They were surrounded by a cheering crowd. Eleanor Vance, her name finally cleared, was weeping tears of joy, hugging her daughter as if she would never let go. Sal Genovese was there, too. He had been placed in protective custody and had testified via a live video feed. He stood off to the side, watching the scene with a quiet, satisfied smile. Abigail caught his eye and gave him a nod of profound gratitude. He had been the unlikely hero, the man who had chosen honor over safety. A few days later, a long, black car pulled up outside Abigail and Eleanor's small apartment building. Samuel Thorne stepped out. He had come with an offer: a full scholarship to the university of her choice, followed by a guaranteed place at the country's top law school, all funded by an anonymous benefactor who had been deeply moved by her story. He believes, Thorne said, a twinkle in his eye, that the world needs more people like you. People who aren't afraid to stand up to the powerful. Abigail looked at her mother, whose face was shining with pride. She thought of Martha in the jail cell, of her son Danny, of all the faceless victims of a broken system. Her fight had started with her mother, but it had become something much bigger. It had become her calling. She shook Samuel Thorne's hand, her grip firm, her eyes clear and focused on the future. The girl in the second-hand blazer had faced down a corrupt judge and a mob boss, and had won. Her journey was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. She was no longer just the maid's daughter. She was Abigail Vance, and she was going to change the world. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. We are always trying to improve our stories, so feel free to also drop your feedback in the comment section below. Thanks for spending this time with me.